evening, everybody, by the way. I hope you guys and girls are all well. Our titles differ slightly, but I think fundamentally what we're going to be talking about over the next kind of 45 minutes is really about RIBA 2030 as a framework, kind of lightest touch, just kind of introducing to that. But fundamentally, whether it's how to meet your RIBA 2030 climate change targets or optimizing your building design process to RIBA 2030, fundamentally, I'm going to be talking about ways in which we believe you can do a far more robust job of designing buildings to ever more stringent targets and energy efficiency targets and well-being targets within the built environment. So that's the general kind of premise of the talk. If you guys are not familiar with us, I run a practice called Mesh Energy. We're based down in the south of the UK, in Farnham in Surrey, but we do projects across the UK and Europe and even in the States. But fundamentally, our position, we're not architects, we are independent and holistic energy consultants. And what that means to the layman is we often partner with architects and design professionals and work with you at any of the RIBA stages, ideally through most of them, to give you some continuity and increase your chances of success for your design going through. We're not sponsored by any manufacturer, and we are really working on the client's behalf with you guys to really give you the toolkit and the experience that you need to tackle any form of sustainable building design, be it small or large. So that's kind of my position, and that's hopefully what I'm bringing to the table. Some kind of independent thinking here, no biases. So what we'll cover in the talk coming up, we're going to be talking about the RIBA stages, just reminding you of those if you haven't looked at them recently, but also looking at the sustainable aspects of those. We're going to be looking at what I call the sustainable design toolkit, which is increasingly the range of tools that you guys have available to analyze your designs with. And then looking at design risk and reward, some things that you may be or may be not aware of as far as design risk is concerned. And then we'll be looking at the sustainable and successful design process. So how you can change and better your design process. And then I've finished up with some case studies and examples and some kind of key takeaways just to wrap up. So that's what we're intending to cover. So to start with, hopefully you guys are familiar already with the RIBA 2030 climate challenge. If you are not, and you've just heard it mentioned, fundamentally it comes as a result of RIBA declaring a climate emergency back in 2019, but also the UK's drive to reach kind of this point of carbon neutrality by 2050. Obviously, local councils have declared a lot of climate emergencies, and RIBA responded to that by coming up with this relatively simple 4-module framework, which includes everything from operational energy demand to embodied carbon, health and well-being, and potable water usage. And over the course of the decade, they lay out a framework for reducing from where we are today, basically building regulations and not very tricky, to some very, very stringent reductions, particularly in embodied carbon and operational energy usage. But it's quite a well-rounded scheme. We've done webinars and there's lots of stuff to read on the RIBA 2030 climate challenge, but that's a very, very brief introduction. So it's on that basis that we then look at the design process, the challenges and the opportunities. So the big question here is this is fundamentally the problem that a lot of practices have, and maybe you've come across this yourself, but how do you get from an initial sketch to figuring out how you meet these bits of the target, selecting which level you want to go to and successfully meeting those, and then from there, or including those, keeping costs under control without them spiraling out of control because you set these lofty goals, making sure the project keeps all its plates spinning, and ultimately ending up with a kind of a happy client, happy stakeholders, and hopefully winning some awards out of it as well. Now, hopefully most of those chunks you already do, i.e. keeping the clients happy, winning awards, keeping the costs under control and coming up with some conceptual ideas. But it's this injection of RIBA 2030 and some additional hurdles, which brings in a lot of, or increasingly, a lot of complexity. So we'll help you try and understand that and try and help you with figuring out how you interlace that into your current design methodologies based on our experience. So if we go right back to the beginning here and just have a look at the RIBA stages, I'm not going to go through these. You guys should know these. You guys should dream about these RIBA stages. But these are the RIBA stages as they stand at the moment. But what's important in the context of this talk is understanding how sustainability and sustainable actions permeate these different stages. And so we've got a lookup table here. I apologize if the text is too small. Hopefully on the recording here, or I'm happy to share this presentation with you guys. You can focus on this particular slide, but this gives you an idea here. So you've got across the top, you've got the RIBA stages, and then down the side here, you've got environmental concerns, social concerns, economic concerns, as well as some kind of core objectives at the top here. So you can see there's all kinds of things in strategic definition. You've got appointing sustainability champions. You've got looking at aspirations, environmental aspirations, looking at bioregional analysis. And as you work through these stages, you get more and more refined. There's more and more things to do. And as you can see from stage 4, well, even actually from stage 1, things start dropping off. So as the design improves and gets more finite and more detailed, then once you get into construction, you know, there are smaller things you've done. But this does give you an idea of the amount of effort required in the various stages and the things that you should be doing or being aware of at the very least. And the reason I put this up, other than because you may not have seen this before, and this may ring some bells during the various RIBA stages, is I thought I would highlight, again, based on our experience, what stuff isn't being done on a typical project. So sustainable projects, I thought I'd just highlight chunks of this which we think people are struggling with or just simply not doing. So everything circled in red here is often missed on a lot of projects, even though they try and be sustainable. And there's quite a lot of red circles there. And that's just kind of setting the scene for you guys as to some of the things that you've got to tackle going forward. And I thought I would put another kind of couple of simple graphics up to show kind of before and after, you know, again, what typically happens on projects today and where I think you need to get to, and doesn't take a lot of effort to get to, but it looks at distribution of effort through the projects. So if we overlay in a very, very simple way the thing that you've seen under these RIBA stages into a kind of an effort required diagram, hopefully this rings some bells. So at the moment on most projects, there may be some kind of vague sustainability aspirations. You know, you kind of get to stage 2, you may or not have mentioned it to the client in the very earliest client briefing meetings, but there may be some pre-planning application requirements. Maybe I don't know, the planners are asking you to prove a 10% carbon reduction, or they want to see some kind of energy statement or some design stage SAP calculations, kind of a token gesture in most cases. And as a result, I don't know, maybe you put some solar panels on your house or your building, or you say you're going to do something sustainable, which has an effect on the design stage SAP calculations. Then when you get to detailed design, you talk to your MEP engineer, you know, maybe putting in a heat pump, maybe you're putting in MVHR, maybe you're doing something else, maybe you're putting in a biomass boiler, maybe you're doing none of the above, but you leave it up to the MEP engineer to get you something sustainable in there. But what also happens at the moment is there's a lot of trust put in installers to kind of pick the system that they want. And a lot of people will contact installers very early on in the design process. In fact, MEP engineers will often contact installers to help them with their designs during stage 4. And funnily enough, an installer will tell you what they make a fair bit of money installing. And then you have kind of SAP calculations and EPC. Hopefully, if everything goes well, you're compliant at the end of the project. But as you can see here, it's quite sporadic. And this is where we see the evolution of sustainable building design that are being done successfully today and we'll see continue into the future. And that is around at a much earlier stage, in stage 1, talking to the client about their sustainability aspirations, really getting to the nub of what the hopes and the dreams of the client are, whether they're a commercial client or whether they're a domestic client, doesn't matter. Just asking the question at an earlier stage. Looking at benchmarking of your conceptual designs. So once you've done your initial massing and you've got an idea for the building, actually looking at that, interrogating that, and finding out how that performs against RIBA 2030 or any other kind of energy efficiency metric that you're using. And then looking at stage 3 as you run up to your planning application, again, kind of improving, if you have found weaknesses in the design, improving on those. We're not talking about spending hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours on analysis here, but giving you some better tools to iterate and optimize the design, and also tell a better story when you go in for planning. And then surprisingly, actually, there's less work to do when you get into the MEP kind of design stage, but it's a lot more considered, it's a lot more holistic. And then the installer, you do a proper tender process, and you're telling the installer what they need to quote for. You're not letting the installer drive the specification process. And then through construction, you're kind of keeping tabs on the project and making sure that nothing's going off the rails. And then at the end of the project, when the client's moved in and after you guys have walked away, doing some light touch kind of post-occupancy evaluation. And you can see here the distribution is far different from that first one that I showed you. And successful sustainable design and meeting your RIBA 2030 targets relies on taking a far more spread out and continuous and joined up approach through the project design and execution. The other thing as well to mention is that RIBA 2030 targets are not all equal. You cannot drop these targets in late in the technical design phase. We had that recently on a project, and the client, not necessarily the client, but the architect has been really disappointed. They set a high bar very late in the project, had gone far too far down the design road, and have missed some of these RIBA targets by a country mile. Some have been okay, but some have been really badly missed. And what I wanted to do here was, so we've got the various RIBA modules. So this is embodied carbon, this is operational energy use, this is health and well-being, and this is potable water usage. And this gives you an idea relative to the RIBA stages when you need to start analysing the buildings against these targets. Embodied carbon, your principles of construction are fundamental to the embodied carbon in the design. So if you head off down a particular road, get your concept design together, go through planning, nail your colours to the mast, and then find out that you want to hit some really stringent targets for RIBA 2030, it's likely that you could be quite wide of the mark. Or in fact, you could have chosen materials that are overly expensive, and you've gone above and beyond and wasted the client's money. So embodied carbon and health and well-being, particularly from use of glazing, natural ventilation, those kind of things at earlier stages really have to be thought about and analysed. And as you go on, potable water usage can be kind of dealt with as you get into the kind of technical design phase or latter phases of stage 3. But operational energy usage, there are things that you can do there, which you can leave slightly later. And the reason that I've put these kind of pound signs against the health and well-being here is that, and I should have done this against operational energy usage actually, is the later on you leave these items in the design stage, you can solve them, but it often means throwing technology at the solution, and that adds cost, isn't very elegant, and will end up increasing running costs as well as capital costs. So to save cost on a project, paradoxically, the earlier that you think about those things and the earlier advice that you get, the more money you're going to save the client in both capital expenditure and operational expenditure. And this was just a simple graphic to kind of give you an idea of when you should start thinking about these things. So our observations from a lot of projects that we've done is that right at the very beginning, there's very poor sustainable aspiration questioning. We find that very, very few architects and professionals are asking their clients about what's important to them as far as sustainability, what it means to them, what they, what they dream of, or what they're hoping to do, or how little or much they're hoping to do. The questions just aren't being asked. There's assumptions being made. Kind of as a result, but this is another observation, is sustainability targets aren't properly being selected necessarily for the right reasons. A lot of that comes from poor sustainability aspiration questioning at the start. The actual strategy, the actual fundamental energy strategy and sustainability strategy for the building is not being explored early enough. It's being left after planning. That's too late. Increasingly, that's too late in the project. But also, clients are being scared off with some of the myths around sustainable building design, and investment isn't being made early enough in the conceptual designs and kind of developed designs before planning to make sure that a robust solution is being engineered. So there's worry about project budget, but as I say, it's costing the project more in the long run by not doing that work earlier on in the design stages. And this is really important. The result here is, if you don't know what the aspirations are and you don't spend the money, it's impossible to benchmark your early stage designs and know how to properly progress the designs. There may be some really strong elements of designs, but you don't know. If you haven't analysed it, you don't know what's strong and what's weak. Costs rise due to kind of a fragmented and piecemeal approach to sustainable design if you don't get your act together. But most importantly, I think that this is big stuff here for the client and for the design team. There are cost saving and just amazing design opportunities that are being missed if you kind of rumble on the way that you're going with sustainable design. There's as much opportunity here as there's potential risk reduction if you change the way in which you design for buildings. And so there are kind of three key questions here which you need to kind of keep asking yourself, and I'll come back to this. And this is, when should you be designing in the building RIBA stages for sustainability? Who should be doing that? Who should be involved in that process? And what should you do? And we'll come back to this, but those are fundamentally the questions which there's a lot of uncertainty about. But to properly understand that, we need to just rewind a bit and have a look at the kind of the sustainability design toolkit that we've got at your disposal. And again, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what there is available to be used here. So for operational energy and embodied carbon analysis against the RIBA 2030 targets, there are static kind of almost kind of Excel spreadsheet calculations that you can do for energy usage for a building. There are various kind of European assessments that you can do, again, which are kind of Excel static based. But then increasingly, there are more complex modeling that you can do, what we call dynamic energy modeling, which is almost kind of building physics, and a whole raft of kind of bespoke calculators that you can use. Embodied carbon, there are free tools. We have a free embodied carbon calculation tool. Field and Clegg Bradley Studios has an Excel tool available. There are plugins for Revit. But then there's also a massive raft of professional tools. So there's One Click LCA, SEMA Pro, Sphera, and a whole kind of raft of other ones which cost thousands and thousands of pounds to run. You need proper education and training for those. So in these, as the other two that I'm going to show you, you can go free and basic analysis, or you can go heavy and some more detailed analysis as well. Health and well-being, we're looking at ventilation modeling, thermal modeling again, daylighting modeling, and generally speaking, to kind of tick the health and well-being box on the analysis front, there's very little that can be done in a kind of a cheap way here. You've got to get into the detail because there's so many interrelated parts of it. Potable water usage, a very, very basic Part G domestic calculator. That's pretty much an Excel calculator. And there are some basic BREEAM calculators as well. So potable water usage is something you could, if you really wanted to, you could do within your practice, as well as the early stage embodied carbon calculators. But some of these other ones really quite quickly are going to require professional involvement. And again, the best, sorry, before I go on to the next graphic, this is, again, just to kind of simply show graphically how you interrogate these RIBA targets. This was the best way that I could do of doing this. So there's a whole raft of proprietary software and calculators that you can use to work out embodied carbon or come up with an energy strategy. You know, a one-man band in a broom cupboard could tell you what your renewable energy strategy, say, could be for your particular project. You might have a free calculator you've downloaded to help you with the embodied carbon at early stages. And again, you may go to a SAP assessor or an energy assessor to help you with your water calculation. You may do that at the moment to meet Part G of the building regulations. But when you look at the more detailed end of embodied carbon, operational energy, and health and well-being, you can actually tick a lot of these off by using a building physics model. And we'll talk more about that, and it doesn't cost a ferocious amount of money to do, but does have a huge amount of benefits when you're looking at benchmarking and as you get into more detailed design and also feedback at the back end of the project and actually, in fact, through construction. So if you're careful about how you select the tools that you use, you can hang together meeting these RIBA 2030 targets throughout the duration of the project, rather than, say, fragmenting the analysis of all of this. In many cases, there's a lot of overlap in these. And to really get that robust design done, it would be good to have a kind of a centralized model, and we'll come on to that. So these tools are available. They're within most people's price points. Again, you can go in heavy, you can go in light, but this shows you a bit more holistically how you can use these tools to tick off the various RIBA 2030 targets. And just one final graphic here. Here are the RIBA stages. This is how I see Excel and what I would classify as free calculators used in the various stages. And then when you need to start blending that in with more professional tools, calculators and consultants. So you see this taper. Once you've done your initial kind of concept designs, you're okay with free calculators there. But as you go through the concept design stage, you really need to start ramping up the level of analysis that you're doing to really make sure that indeed what you're getting back from these free tools can be relied upon. But also from a cost point of view, you know, the client doesn't want to pay mega money for analysis in these very early stages, but you can blend this out. So as you get into more complicated software, you can nudge up the price of that analysis, but also get far more peace of mind because more rigorous analysis have been done through stages 2 and into stages 3. And certainly at stages 2 and stages 3, where you can lose and gain a huge amount in intelligent design. So this tapering is really, really important. And there's always going to be the, I guess, appetite to use those free tools as far as you can into the design process. And that's fine, but you are risking a rigorous design the further and further and further that you push it into stages 2 and into stages 3. So it's getting that blend right, and that's where experience counts, and that's where we can kind of help out, you know, kind of showing you the value versus the expenditure. So design risk and reward. I've tried to make this as dare I say, as entertaining as possible. Seems quite boring, but this is so important. Sustainable building design is risky for the reasons that I'm just about to tell you. And that's mainly through lack of understanding. So sustainable project risk is rising. The reason our buildings are becoming more complicated, we're using more innovative technology. There are more systems in the building than there ever have done before. There are more variables and interrelated targets that are being used. You know, the bar is getting higher for sustainability, and we're getting to the thin end of the wedge when it comes to energy efficiency of buildings. And so success and failure is becoming far, dare I say, easier to achieve. You can, just the slightest variation can mean the difference between being successful or being a failure in the eye of the client and for these targets. There's multiple system dependencies. Tolerances for error are fast diminishing, and sustainable technologies when you get to that stage are quite costly. The fact that you're a lot of sustainable building design has, let's take underfloor heating, for example, that's in the floor. The mechanical ventilation heat recovery is in the floor structure or in the ceiling. You may have a hot water and heating system, which is, weaves its way through the building. So to get that wrong is very, very costly compared to your good old fashioned gas boiler, where you've got, pipes and any old plumber can put them in with simple radiators. So making changes and realizing there have been mistakes is becoming very, very costly for projects, or more costly for projects. But the final thing there is actually clients care more. So when you think about risk in the wider context, if a client says they want a sustainable project and you've agreed to targets and you get that wrong, not only has it been potentially more costly for the client, at a very, very emotional level, to have missed that either slightly or by a country mile because of lack of design due diligence is going to kick hard. And the clients, because they care more, are going to make sure they get their pound of flesh. So for all these reasons, sustainable project risk is rising. It's not to say it can't be mitigated, but you need to be aware of the risks. It's not all fun and games. You've got to take this pretty seriously. So this was, coming back to this slide, this was the distribution of where we are at the moment with kind of sustainable design. And this is where we really need to kind of get to, this far more distributed and joined up thinking through the lifetime of a project. And this is the best way that I could describe risk on a project. So we've got green, good to go; amber, moderate risk; red, big no. You're into some pretty sticky territory there, risking all kinds of things. This is the perceived risk for many with sustainable design, mainly because of ignorance or lack of experience. So I think most people can appreciate that, there needs to be care and attention getting the design done right. But few, once we're out of technical design, things should get easier. It might bobble around a bit, but everybody knows what they're doing, right? A heat pump installer, when you go to a heat pump installer, they're bound to know what they're doing. More and more people have put in underfloor heating. How wrong could it go? Well, that's fine. But again, there is a lot of ignorance around that. This is actually the risk that the project is likely to be experiencing. And the fundamental reason for this is that most projects don't get adequate feedback. And that may sound, kind of trivial, but if there is more risk of a project going off the rails, and you need to make sure that you get experienced feedback, modeling feedback, some kind of feedback rather than using your prior experience. Otherwise, you're really going to end up in a pretty sticky and costly situation pretty fast. That can be resolved in most cases. So if you kind of eventually get on the straight and narrow and you eventually get feedback on the design and eventually somebody sees sense and pays for some consulting or speaks to the right individual, and you realize that you've dropped the ball, it can be put right. But depending on what phase you're in, it's going to cost more and more money to put it right. Making the right decisions or getting these adjustments done as early as possible, getting that feedback as early as possible, ideally when you're in the paper stage, is the ideal. Once you get more and more consultants on board, once you've got more and more detailed design done, once you're on site, things, as we all know, rapidly get very, very expensive and get increasingly harder to put right. So that's the actual risk that most projects are up against. Now, with feedback, you can minimize the risk of sustainable projects considerably. In fact, the risk of a sustainable design project can be far lower than a traditional build, because in traditional projects, we haven't got this mindset of getting feedback. We use our experience, and so feedback isn't needed. Experience is our kind of feedback, and people are familiar with that. So as we use progressively more and more tools and we get more familiar with sustainable design projects, we can actually drive the risk even further because we're being more rigorous in the design process. So that's the benefit. That's the benefit, but you've got to get your head around needing feedback in order to contain that and end up with far more successful projects. So the rewards are better client sustainability insight. You've done early stage questioning and you potentially involve the client in these early stage designs, sustainability designs. Your team gets valuable feedback. You reduce the risk of kind of subtle design changes. Because again, you've kind of got feedback on that. Importantly, actually, the difficult questions about sustainability get thrashed out at a far earlier stage. You know, there's far less assumptions made. The big difficult questions get asked and answered early. There's a more considered specification phase because it's more important. Remember, you want to be in the position where you're specifying something to an installer. You're not just letting an installer have free rein on what they think is the best solution. So there's less gray areas. You're more thorough in the specification phase. There's an opportunity for valuable feedback and learning, improve client satisfaction, but also significantly higher building sustainability at minimal or no extra cost. So those are the overall rewards that you can easily get from every single project that you do if you improve the design process. So the successful sustainable design process. There's a few key takeaways here, and I will take you through the RIBA stages. But let me just walk you through this. There's a few key things to get your head around, and you may be doing some of this already. And of course, I'm having to amplify this to kind of get the point across. But you need to get from linear design and thinking on your projects to something which is more akin to a kind of hub and spoke. You need to view your project as very much a kind of in a systems thinking way, rather than, right, we've done that bit, we'll move on to the next bit. We've done that bit, we'll move on to the next bit. There's a lot more interrelated here, and there's a lot more you can get from the design if you think about it in a more holistic fashion. But also have a think about the ways that the way in which you interact and bring key design team members or involve the client in the design process. Think about what effect and what positive impacts that could have. Again, I've exaggerated this, but don't think of a building design process as the client says what they want, you guys design something, then there are a couple of consultants involved, they get told what, you know, the bounds of the problem, then there's another specialist involved, then the builder gets told what to build, and then they hand that over to the client. That is very, very old school thinking, and again, massively increases the chance of risk and wasted money. What you're aiming for is to better understand the client, include the client in these early stage conceptual designs, get some key consultants involved at the earlier stages, maybe even a builder or other specialists that you may have left till later. Bring them into earlier discussions, use that knowledge and thrash out earlier on in the project where you can do these design ideas and risks. And again, the more involved you get the design team at the earliest stage, the more buy-in you get. You know, that's going to hold a huge amount of gravitas with the client when they see that this is, the project is being done in a way that they've never heard of before and is far more collaborative, and their opinions are being heard about and shared, and you're not protecting the client against these other specialists. We found that to be very, very successful as well for the long-term benefit of the project. The other key thing as well is around, if you've talked to the client early and set targets, is you're more likely to know where you're going, and you're more likely to know what success looks like. I've used this reasoning before on another webinar that I did and in other talks that I've done. But if you don't understand from the client what they deem as success as far as sustainable targets are concerned, the project will never be successful. It doesn't matter how successful you think the project is. It doesn't matter how successful we think the project is, or the structural engineer or the landscape architect or whatever. It's the client that matters here. So if they have been clear about what they deem as successful, and particularly around their sustainable aspirations, and you've helped them convert that into a deliverable project, you know when you hit that, that is going to be, you know, the bullseye as far as their project success criteria is concerned. So once you understand these targets, the next logical thing to do is intelligently get there as quickly and as cost effectively as possible, not shotgun all the options and randomly try and kind of figure it out. You need to bring experience on board, and you need to figure out where the concept is strong and where the concept is weak. Work on those weaker areas, you know, amp up or tweak maybe the stronger areas just to put the cherry on top if that's what's needed, and understand where the quick wins are, and then real aspects of the design that you've got to work on to make sure you end up with a winning project. So you can break the RIBA stages down into understanding aspirations in stage 0, setting sustainable goals, intelligent sustainable goals in stage 1, and really stages 2 to 6, everything from concept design to handover is all about analysis and feedback, and analysis and feedback, and analysis and feedback. And in fact, stage 7, again, is about feedback. It's about you, the design team, and the client learning from that project, and then you being able to use that on another project for, you know, for somebody else's benefit. What that practically means, so let's kind of brass tacks here. What this practically means is you need to better understand client aspirations. You need to get in there early. First meeting you have with a client, ask about their sustainable aspirations. Agree and set realistic and ideally progressive goals. And again, your better understanding of the RIBA 2030 framework will help with that, or whether it's BREEAM or whatever it is. If you better understand what it takes to meet these targets, you can more confidently agree targets with your client, because some of these things are voluntary. It may not be that the clients are being forced into this. It may be a voluntary thing. So you don't want to overstretch, but likewise, you want to be progressive. And some clients will be up for progressive goals. Involve key team members early. But most importantly here, and say you can blend this in, is making building physics or having some kind of centralized 3D model, which you can keep coming back to and changing and tweaking and optimizing. We see that as a big change going forward, rather than asking your SAP assessor what he thinks, and then somebody else does a report, and then somebody else does a report, and somebody else does a report. You need this safe haven in the design that you can kind of come back to, check, balance, benchmark, optimize, gives you confidence through the construction phases, and also you can compare your end results to that model, what we call the performance gap. So those are the kind of the practical steps that we're talking about. And I'm not talking about making all those changes in one go, but certainly something to consider. So we'll come back to when, who, and what, and then we'll just quickly take you through the RIBA stages again. And I've got a mnemonic here, which is called understand, which kind of hopefully will help you remember it. But if nothing else, it's a word in the English language that kind of hangs together with the RIBA stages. So when you're thinking about sustainability, stage 0 is all about uncovering client aspiration for the goals. Stage 1 is about defining the sustainability goals. Stage 2 is about energy benchmarking the design. And this is so important. Understand how strong your concept is against those goals, and you'll save a lot of time. Refine, iterate, and optimize as you start to develop the design. And again, you'll find opportunity here that you never thought existed. Stage 4, specify the holistic strategy. Get really specific here that you've got to. This is important. And this should be relatively easy because you've done a lot of the hard thinking. It's just getting down to the nuts and bolts. Stage 5, when you get into the construction phase of the project, take care of the detail here. And I mean that kind of in a practical sense. Make sure you deliver that detail on site. Nail commissioning and handover. So commissioning is often overlooked. Commissioning for sustainable buildings is so important, and particularly client education when it comes to handing over this building to them and how that relates to the energy strategy and the systems within it. In stage 7, discuss internally and learn from the feedback of that project. You've got a model which is a combination of noughts and ones. And then if you've got feedback as to how the building's actually performing in real life, that value, that information is like gold dust. And I could probably count on one hand how many of the people on the call have done that. So in simple terms, use this as a kind of a reminder of what's important through those RIBA stages. So in stage 0, it should be the architect and the client involved in this. Understand sustainable aspirations and uncover the client's why. Why are they interested in a sustainable building? Again, yourself and the client working on sustainable targets and setting realistic goals that the client can buy into and you can realistically deliver. And then we start introducing the energy consultant, and it may be that the structural engineer gets involved at this stage or other specialists, but certainly explain to the client and understand yourself that it's important that you need to benchmark the design at this stage. So you've got a concept, you may be using some free tools yourself, but you must using slightly more intelligent software, benchmark the design and understand the strengths and weaknesses. Again, as you go into stage 3, tackle the weakest elements of the design, refine and optimize and solidify that holistic strategy. And by the end of stage 3, you really need that strategy together. And remember, as you go into planning, the more robust that strategy, just think of that fascinating story that you can tell the planning officer. And it may be that it's a lovely thing to have for most applications, but depending if you're doing more commercial work, this could be the difference between a big yay or a big nay for that application. So you've got a more robust design and you've got a better chance of getting planning as well. Sustainability is right at the top of the agenda for a lot of planners. So it will really make your application stand out if you've done that thinking already. Stage 4, again, we do a lot of work with architects at this stage, and of course the structural engineers involved, and the main design team is heavily involved here. And importantly here, you're confirming your energy compliance targets, so you can have almost 100% confidence that if you build as per the specification, you're going to meet these targets without any problem whatsoever. You can even check your SAP calculations and EPC rating to make sure at this early stage, because you've got this centralized model. So making sure that your detailed MEP design catches up or is checked against your centralized model is really, really beneficial. Again, through construction, you can test if you end up with variations in construction. You can test that against that model. What effect will it have? Maybe there's a real spanner in the works as part of the construction, something has been missed, but you can check against the model what kind of effect that will have on the overall energy strategy. And deal with that appropriately. And then as we get into handover and commissioning, make the client aware of how the system is supposed to be performing so they don't fiddle. Commissioning of multiple systems that are interacting is really, really important. And then that final stage, stage 7, do understand what light touch post-occupancy evaluation means. We've actually got a webinar coming up on this. It's not as involved as you imagine. It's a simple questionnaire for the client. It's a quick look at their energy bills. It's not sensors in every single room measuring 50 different things every 5 seconds. It is not that detailed, but just some feedback is invaluable. And again, you can compare it to the centralized model. So even starting doing some of these elements will help you with the sustainable design process. And I would strongly encourage that you have a look at what you're doing to see if you can interleave some of these things in to what you're currently doing. So to summarize, this is the mnemonic that we're using there. Joshua, have we got 10 minutes just to run through a couple of quick case studies?
Yeah, we should have. Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes to 7 o'clock, and then we can move into some Q&A.
Okay, otherwise I'm happy to do that and do the Q&A. If you want me to run on for another 10 minutes, I can just talk about a couple of quick case studies.
Yeah, a couple of case studies would be good, I think, just to see.
Fine. Okay, fine. So the first case study that we've got here is one that we did for Snug Architects down in Southampton. This building that you can see here is actually their offices. So this office exists on a first floor level, and they were looking at a second story kind of extension. And they had RIBA 2030 goals that they were trying to meet. Now, every project has its different RIBA 2030 opportunities and challenges. And this particular project, because Snug Architects were financing this themselves, capital expenditure was top of their agenda. They had a fixed budget and they really wanted to do as much as they could do with it, and they couldn't really spend a penny over that. But also because they were landlords and they were using this space, operational expenditure and their running costs were really key to balance out as well. So, you know, they could have looked at fabric efficiency, all manner of renewable technologies, air tightness, and their capital costs would have increased. Remember, this is on an existing building. And so they were trying to blend out these two, what was an acceptable running cost versus this RIBA 2030 project that they were trying to use as a case study for themselves. And they were trying to achieve, when they first came to us, they were trying to achieve RIBA 2030 kind of across the board, which is a lofty target, you know, and for an existing building, for embodied carbon, that's a pretty easy win because you take into account the existing building as part of that, and that gets you a lot of brownie points. But for operational energy in a building that was built, I think, in the middle of last century, that was quite difficult. And the potable water usage as well for that commercial premises was very, very difficult to tackle and improve. And we went through numerous we were in stages 3 with this project when we were approached. And they were keen to explore lots and lots of different options. I think we went through kind of 4 completely different iterations for the extension design for the building. And I think, you know, generally speaking, they got there. You know, the overheating, health and well-being, overheating and ventilation was to the RIBA 2030 standards. Embodied carbon was well below the RIBA 2030 standards. They struggled with operational energy efficiency because their budget wouldn't quite stretch to making the insulation improvements that they were after. They were very stuck with the level of glazing, and they wanted a lot of glazing. They weren't going to spend money on the glazing, and so they didn't quite hit the RIBA 2030 targets for that, and they missed the potable water usage targets by a country mile. But generally speaking, you know, they kind of did okay. You know, they got 30-ish. You know, for over 50% of what they did there. The next case study, this was for Southampton County Council. So they were looking at what they could do for the next 10,000 houses, and they were looking at testing different building types. They were essentially terrace houses, but testing a particular typology, which could be orientated a particular way, roughly had a particular form, and seeing what they would have to do with that typology to meet the various RIBA 2030 targets. And that they were interested in RIBA 2025 and RIBA 2030. So we worked with them actually in stage 2. You know, they were kind of the client. I mean, I guess it could have been classified as stage 1, but they had some concept design, so we'll call it kind of stage 2. And fundamentally, they were looking at balancing out the materials and the constructions that they were used to. You know, they had investors which had a particular risk profile and particular methods of construction that they are happy to put their money against, and then others which they weren't. So we explored these more traditional building constructions to see if, other than kind of keeping costs under control, whether you could hit the RIBA 2030 targets. And as it turned out, they managed to achieve it. They just scraped RIBA 2030 using a traditional brick and block with kind of Celotex or PIR insulation infill cavity. And the thing that got them there to these targets using a traditional construction was actually air tightness of the buildings. So we helped them define what the air tightness of the buildings would have to be, and also the insulation in the ground slab and the roofs in order to get the operational efficiency down as well. The buildings had no issues with overheating because they had a lot of masonry in them in that particular case. So this was a more kind of exploratory conceptual idea with the council. And had they chosen, lower embodied energy materials, they could have done even better. But it was surprising what could be done with traditional means. And in many respects, it was quite a pleasing project to work on, not least because they were actually keen to explore what they could do with what they knew. And I think we worked out that the capital uplift in order to meet RIBA 2030 for their particular projects was in around about the 8% mark in capital expenditure. So they went away to think if they could, whether they could bear that and whether they were interested in hitting those targets going forward. And that's where we kind of left the project. So those were our couple of really, really quick 2030 case studies. We have got more explanation of case studies that we've done against RIBA 2030 and other webinars that we've done. So do check out the YouTube channel that we've got. So finally, quick takeaways. Uncover sustainability aspirations in the first client meeting. Understand yourself, then educate the clients on sustainable design goals. Invest in specialist advice from key stakeholders as early as possible in your design process without breaking the bank. Seriously consider having a centralized building model, building physics model that can give you feedback on these various RIBA 2030 pieces of the puzzle. And then taper your kind of free analysis and your professional analysis as you go through the stages as appropriate, and spend more time in stages 3 and 4 to really make sure you've got a rigorous design before you commit to construction. That is it, folks. We're pretty much on the hour. Hopefully that was a good amount of information to digest. As I say, more than happy to share the presentation with you guys. So any questions, feel free to fire away.
Thank you, Doug. Yes, very informative and interesting. Yeah, I think I was talking to a couple of people offline, and they were thoroughly absorbed and completely forgot to ask any questions. So yes, thank you for taking the time out to give us the presentation. There's a couple of questions that have come in. One from Ben Price, our social secretary. He asks, given that the industry has started to transition further into BIM workflows, have you found that it is becoming easier or more effective to emphasize the sustainability through such processes? If so, does that help to offset the concerns of balancing the cost which are sometimes associated with BIM and those kind of workflows?
I think so. I mean, hands up, we haven't done a lot with BIM, but fundamentally, the concept is still the same, and that's kind of what's encouraging. We're aware of BIM, and obviously on bigger projects, it's used more and more, particularly government projects. But I think what is interesting, I mean, we've come at it from a different angle, which is because we're driven by sustainability, and the M&E design is a necessary part. We have come to the conclusion that a centralized model is the most cost-effective way of designing sustainable buildings, and joining the process up together, not because we use BIM, but because through the other processes in design and seeing how painful it can be when it's fragmented at those earlier stages, that's the conclusion that we've come to. Now, it doesn't take a massive leap of imagination to imagine, BIM and sustainability, the overlap becoming almost kind of imperceptible. But the fact that both of these methodologies are based on a centralized model that multiple people have access to, mean that you're not remodeling things. You haven't got, multiple consultants using their different ways and means and methodologies of doing that. So that this kind of centralized language and understanding, and doing things once rather than doing things five times and things getting lost in translation. I definitely there is no shadow of a doubt there is a cost saving. And I think we're in a transitory process here where BIM and building physics workflow models, from our point of view, yeah, some clients see that as an on cost that is, is kind of over and above what's needed. But I think if they properly understood the risks of doing it another way as we move to more detailed building design, over the next few years, it will become a non-conversation.
Yeah.
Methodologies will change for everybody's benefit, and it will just become a no-brainer. Your project has to be run that way in order for it to be successful.
Yeah, I think it's often difficult from a client perspective when they're only doing the one building and it's the one project, and they're investing a lot in it. Unless they're a commercial architect who regularly, or a commercial client rather, who regularly do developments and different projects, it can be difficult to highlight the investment and the cost in something that's a bit more what's the word, centralized, as you say, and kind of
and I think it's there are various things that are affecting that, but it's all of our responsibilities, as I say, to understand the pros and cons of doing it both ways, and and share case studies, and it's all of our roles individually to educate the clients who are doing this for the first time, and as we gain more experience, that will become easier to do.
Yeah, cool. To be better prepared for prior to entering the profession, at a point where we don't necessarily have experience to support us. Have you had much kind of interaction with architectural students? Have you been into universities and kind of seen the current input? I know from my own experience, a while, when I was back at university, it was limited, but the kind of the BIM process and the more joined up thinking, shall we say, was only really starting to be emphasized. From your perspective, has that changed much in terms of the younger professionals?
That's a good question. I must admit, I have not seen. We know a number of lecturers who teach architectural students. I've never seen kind of what stuff they get taught, but what I do know, anybody who reads the Architect's Journal or RIBA, I think there is what is disappointing is there are more and more voices being heard, listened to, and articles being written about as a result, which clearly shows the level of education of architectural students is lacking in sustainability. So there's a huge hunger where sustainability fits in. And young kind of passionate students are always keen to know everything, right? It's not always practical, but I think there is a huge amount of work both in institutions, and I'm talking about the RIBA as one of those institutions, which needs to be done on education. And I think what is fascinating, we talked about this before, Joshua, before this webinar started, I think there will be a lot of things happening this year which will be really exciting. I think people have understood that, there are very few boundaries to learning stuff now. The internet's a wonderful place. A lot of information is being shared very, very rapidly. And for those who are willing to learn and willing to spend the time educating themselves, increasingly there are people prepared to share what they know, and hopefully students can get a kind of a running start. So maybe even though their education's let them down a bit, there's a lot of extracurricular stuff that's become available that they can use to bolster, the good old-fashioned book reading and what's up on the slides on their lecture notes to make it more applicable to the real world.
Yeah, hopefully it'll be more honed to kind of be ready, the information that's ready to go when they get to practice. But we'll see. There's certainly some interesting developments coming.
Yeah.
Okay, next question from Aisha Batul. Thank you for a fantastic presentation. Would you say that the 2030 RIBA 2030 challenge opens up more room for interdisciplinary dialogue within the profession of the built environment, i.e. making room for architectural engineers. I ask this because I would imagine that the kind of engineering and building design knowledge, engineering design and design knowledge a sustainable building requires, it would be open room in practices for experts in building and design systems to allow architects to work beyond their silos. And again, I think it comes back to this centralized method of working and the more collaborative method of working that is one of the unique things about architecture and architects' education, is that they're the only ones that are taught in this collaborative style. Well, this is highlighted in research by Flora Samuels. And that's almost lost when you get into the real world, into practice. It's been noted. So yeah, I think going back to the question, sorry, Aisha, do you think that there's the challenge, the RIBA 2030 challenge, kind of has the potential to bring us back to that, or? I think
it does. I mean, I'm a big advocate for collaboration. I think anybody who believes they know everything, needs to move to Mars. The built environment is so complex now. We need to get kind of off our high horses, and even though we're specialists in our own areas, often the opportunity lies in talking to the guy next to you who cares about the project, who has another profession, and where those two meet, that's where the kind of the magic happens.
Yeah.
Because that is, that hasn't been done historically, and things are moving at such a pace that it's going back to the client here, we're trying to figure out what is best for the client, and you find that those interactions, and yes, RIBA 2030, the framework, because of its simplicity, but its focus on some very, very important points there, does open up that discussion without making it laboriously, bureaucratic. And I think that's one of the real wins compared to BREEAM and these kind of things, which cost a small fortune to do. So yes, I do think it opens some big opportunities. It's understandable, and yeah, I don't think there's much else to say. Yes, and I'm really looking forward to being able to see that collaboration improve. And I think there's a lot of, again, talking about the next generation of architects coming through, I think there's a lot of passion to do that. They're not stuck with old ways of working in the silos. They're keen to talk and learn and figure out how they can better improve the buildings that they're working on.
Okay. So another question from Tom: which aspects of the various RIBA 2030 targets do you see as the most important or interesting to focus on in a project? Obviously, the presentation highlights that they're all pretty important, but if there was one that you were to pick out at the moment.
I think, they're all important. I would say the one with the biggest challenge, genuinely the one with the biggest challenge, I was going to say two. The one with, definitely the biggest one is embodied carbon, because people understand least about that. So that's the biggest risk associated with it. But actually, it's it's a pretty challenging subject. Even if you get your head around the numbers, whatever 300 kilos per cubic meter means in the real world, if you get your head around that, the actual mechanics of dare I say, raising a building to the ground and building a brand new building to the RIBA 2030 target is not an easy thing to do at all. And this is, again, where it opens up the discussion about repurposing existing buildings, reusing materials on site, not taking them away, and then paying the penalty for bringing those on site. So that is a real challenge. Embodied carbon every single time trips most projects up, and we're probably on our 6th or 7th RIBA 2030 project. We've done everything from a domestic house to a £20 million commercial spa scheme in Jersey, that and kind of almost everything in between across those 6 projects. Embodied carbon always is a tricky one. Next to that, the overheating aspects of health and well-being, so overheating and ventilation analysis is a really tricky thing for some buildings, particularly blocks of flats, single aspect you know, high-rise buildings, it's quite a difficult one. So embodied carbon quickly followed by certain aspects of health and well-being. Okay, great.
There's a question from Anonymous, who seems to be always in every meeting. A key challenge for improving sustainability targets is the regeneration of existing building stock, as you've mentioned. Do you think the 2030 challenge objectives are more attainable in new builds? I think we've pretty much just answered this one, actually.
Yeah, basically they're more attainable in the existing buildings.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, that's short and sweet for that one.
But every project's different, but generally across the board, yeah.
Yeah, of course.
In the existing building.
It comes down to the budget too, I imagine, as well.
Yeah.
So another question from Hugh: are you aware of any tools that help predict the internal air quality in terms of VOC, which is a further aspect of the 2030 challenge?
Yes and no, respectively, I think. Or sorry, no and yes, respectively. I think, I mean, VOCs is you know, you've got VOCs and formaldehyde levels in the health and well-being section of the RIBA 2030 challenge. And I think, you know, whilst increasingly there are more products, you know, people can buy more responsibly, and formaldehyde particularly, yeah, formaldehyde and VOCs and off-gassing and stuff are starting to be, you know, find their way onto particular product specifications. I think what is really, really important here, and this comes back to air quality, is all of these things are very, very closely related to the ventilation, the appropriate ventilation strategy within the building. So, you know, carbon dioxide 900 parts per million is quoted in the RIBA 2030 health and well-being section, and there is a direct correlation between adequate building ventilation and carbon dioxide particulate, you know, kind of concentrations, and in a way, kind of VOCs is kind of similar. So there's a bit there about ventilation strategy, and then there's a bit there about kind of responsible purchasing, but there's no software as such for VOCs. No, you're really into kind of ventilation modeling just to make sure that it's a healthy building to be living or working in, from that angle at the minute.
Thanks. Okay, there's a few questions in the chat. The one from Aaron: thank you for the presentation. It was most informative. Performance gaps from the design to use are often quite significant. How would you suggest these gaps are closed? In addition to perhaps the methodology that you've outlined in the presentation?
That's a good question. I mean, in the first instance, you've been successful if you know what the gap is. If you've actually managed to quantify the gap. So that's a big tick in the box if you know that there is even one that exists. I mean, secondly, you know, analytically, I think you would have to go through, is it the fact that your energy bills are wildly off what you predicted? Is it that your you know, particular rooms in the building are overheating more or less than you predicted? And I think it depends, you know, it's not just a gap. There'll be gaps, there'll be varying gaps from the performance of the building. Some bits of the model may be spot on, or predictions may be spot on, and others may be way off. And I think you know, you've got to interrogate where you're way off and then start digging into the detail and finding out if it's particular assumptions that you've made in the model, I don't know, say on you know, the window glazing specification, or the way a particular model is treating a particular aspect of the design. So as with all these things, it's kind of focusing down to where the real issue is. It's unlikely to be with the whole model itself. It's going to be some part of that model which is the issue. But if you've got that model to interrogate, and you've asked the right questions, and you've got some key bits of data, you can help refine that after the event, and hopefully
there's often in the analysis of how the building is used
exactly that may be the biggest disparity there. You designed a building for one use, and you turned out that the client sold it on, and it's been used for some other use. So it's never going to be an easy solution. You have got to do a bit of digging.
Yeah. Okay, great. There's a couple of comments from Mike Balcombe here. The climate literacy is part of the RIBA's way ahead to include revisions onto how architecture is taught at university, and also to introduce mandatory competencies for the RIBA chartered architects. So that will be forthcoming. And for those of you who haven't seen the way ahead document, if you Google it on architecture.com, then the current revision of that will come up. He has also posted a link to the architecture policy from RIBA on the 2030 challenge there. So those of you can see that in the chat can follow that link, and we will send it out in the follow-up email as well. Thanks for those, Mike. I think based on time, how are you doing for time, Doug? Are you okay?
Fine. Give it another few minutes. We've got one more question, a couple more questions. We'll wrap up.
Okay. Well, we've got another one from Aisha, who has another question regarding Stage 7 in particular. High performance buildings in North America have taught us that the mindset and behaviour of building occupants play a key role in the actual building performance of the building. Is there an aspect of the 2030 challenge that requires a promise for behavioural change from building occupants? I think we've just covered this inadvertently as well.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to add to that, I guess?
No, I don't think so. I mean, trying to get people to stick to rules and frameworks in their day-to-day life is a tricky one. So the short answer is no. Yeah,
other than kind of generally advising them.
And I think there is an education part to play here, and I think whilst that may seem messy for an architect to kind of get involved in that, again, it's part of the wider education piece, and it doesn't have to be writing a PhD thesis. It's some key comments or key information in documentation or that kind of handover that's really, really critical. And then beyond that, of course, it's up to the client how they, what they decide to do.
Yeah, of course. Okay, I'm just saying if there's any other comments. I think that's everything. There's a couple from Paul has sent me some independently. Let me just review this.
I'm happy to Joshua for you to share my email with the rest of the group. So if anybody thinks of any questions or they want to get in contact, then that's fine.
Okay, great. Well, I think we'll leave it there in that case. There doesn't seem to be anything else that's come through, unless anyone has any last-minute bursting ideas. We'll leave it there, and as you say, we'll share your email address and the contents. And you mentioned earlier the presentation itself. Are you happy for that to be shared too?
Yeah, we'll send you over. Yeah, we'll get that sent over to you. Yeah, happy to. This is all about sharing of information. So whatever you've seen there, happy to share that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Yes. So to wrap up, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to Paul for his time. And this has been recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel in a couple of weeks, hopefully. Just one to close out. We have a few more presentations coming up. Next week we have. Let me just bring the list up. We have one on the 9th of March with Office Sean, with Gurmeet, who's the office lead there, doing a practice profile and discussing various current topics within the architecture world. So that's on the 9th of March. We then have, apologies, the list is delayed. So next week on the 2nd of March, we have an introduction to renewables with David Reed. And then on the 18th of March, we have Jessica and Wiles present at the Pavilion, which is the big development in the centre of Nottingham, for those of you who are aware of it. Yes, so they're the next three presentations that are coming up. So we hope to see you all then at those, and I will close out. So thank you again. Thank you, Doug, and hopefully we'll speak soon.